What if I told you that in 1933, long before the Cold War, before Watergate, before even World War II, a shadowy coalition of America's most powerful businessmen secretly plotted to overthrow the United States government? Not a theory, not a novel, but a real plan, backed by real money with real names. And what's even more shocking, they almost got away with it. While the nation staggered under the weight of the Great Depression, a small circle of Wall Street elites and industrial tycoons met behind closed doors. Their plan? Topple President Franklin D. Roosevelt, abolish democracy, and replace it with a fascist-style regime with a puppet general at the helm. A regime modeled after Hitler and Mussolini, right here in the land of the free. But one man, a decorated war hero, loyal to the Constitution, was offered the job of becoming America's dictator. And instead of leading the coup, he exposed it. His name? Major General Smedley Butler. His testimony? Buried. The plot? Forgotten. For nearly a century, this explosive chapter has been kept in the shadows, dismissed as rumor, ignored by textbooks, and erased from the American memory. Why? Because the men behind it wore suits, not masks. They sat in boardrooms, not bunkers. And they wielded power not through violence, but through wealth, fear, and influence. Today, we shine a light on a secret so unbelievable, so disturbing, it challenges everything you thought you knew about American history. Welcome to Tales Beyond Time. This is the business plot of 1933, America's sinister secret, finally unveiled. The year was 1933, and America was bleeding. Banks had collapsed by the thousands. Entire industries had ground to a halt. Over 15 million Americans, 1 in every 4, were out of work. Factories stood silent. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Farmers destroyed crops because they couldn't afford to harvest them, while families in cities starved. Children scavenged through garbage heaps. Once proud men begged on street corners. And across the nation, a once thriving country had fallen to its knees. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic disaster, it was a national trauma. Hope was evaporating. Into the storm walked a new leader, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He spoke of a New Deal, a radical promise to restore dignity and stability through bold federal reforms. Banking regulation, job creation, social safety nets, public infrastructure, aid to the poor, and protection for workers. But not everyone welcomed this revolution. To millions of suffering Americans, Roosevelt was a lifeline. To others, especially the wealthy elite, who had once controlled the economy unchallenged, he was a dangerous threat to the status quo. Behind gilded doors in New York boardrooms and gentlemen's clubs, whispers of unrest began. Roosevelt, they claimed, was a traitor to his class. His sweeping reforms were seen not as salvation, but as socialism in disguise. A threat to free enterprise, private capital, and inherited privilege. Some feared the man in the White House was moving too fast. Others feared he might actually succeed in dismantling their monopoly on power. And so, a chilling idea began to take root. What if Roosevelt couldn't be stopped through elections, but could be removed by force? Not by rebellion from the poor, but by a silent, calculated coup from the very top. This was no fantasy. The soil was fertile. The money was there. The desperation was real. And the seeds of treason had already been planted. In times of national crisis, some rise to heal the wounds of a broken nation. Others, cloaked in wealth and influence, see crisis as an opportunity to seize control. As Franklin D. Roosevelt unleashed a torrent of New Deal reforms, breaking up monopolies, taxing the rich, empowering workers, and curbing Wall Street's unchecked power, a quiet panic swept through America's financial elite. To them, this wasn't recovery. It was revolution. And so, behind polished mahogany doors, in the private clubs of Manhattan and boardrooms of industrial America, a dangerous question began to surface. What if democracy itself was the problem? What if the only way to save America was to replace it? What emerged was a plan so audacious it bordered on fiction, a secret effort to overthrow the very government they profited from. A conspiracy forged not by radicals or fringe extremists, but by some of the most respected names in American business. These weren't anarchists in back alleys. They were executives in three-piece suits, men connected to jpmorgan, dupont, and Remington Arms, men with ties to Chase Bank, Standard Oil, and the American Legion, men who had watched Mussolini rise to power and admired his order, his efficiency, and above all, his control. They envisioned something similar for America. A corporate fascist state, led not by a politician, but by a soldier, a war hero Americans would trust. Their perfect candidate? Major General Smedley Butler, a legend of the U.S. Marine Corps, twice awarded the Medal of Honor, a man beloved by veterans and working-class Americans. Butler's name was synonymous with patriotism, integrity, and strength. The conspirators believed if they could persuade Butler to march on Washington at the head of a private army 500,000 veterans, loyal and battle-hardened, they could force Roosevelt to surrender power. DR wouldn't be assassinated. He'd simply become irrelevant, replaced by a shadow leader who answered not to the people, but to a coalition of banks and industrial giants. So, they reached out to him. Butler was approached not by random strangers, but by respected intermediaries, men who represented themselves as acting on behalf of powerful corporate interests. They made small talk, tested the waters, spoke in careful euphemisms, and slowly, with disturbing clarity, they laid out their offer. The message was simple and chilling. You, General Butler, are the only man in America who can save it. We'll give you money. We'll give you an army. All you need to do is take command. But they had miscalculated. Because while Smedley Butler had spent his life in service to the flag, he had also seen how empires were built, not for freedom, but for profit. He listened. He took notes. And then, instead of taking power, he sounded the alarm. What the conspirators didn't realize was that the man they tried to recruit had become disillusioned with the very forces they represented. What they had sparked wasn't a quiet coup. It was about to become a scandal that could shake the nation, if only the nation was willing to listen. Major General Smedley Butler was not a man easily fooled. He had served in the United States Marine Corps for 33 years. He had led men into battle in China, Nicaragua, the Philippines, and Haiti. Twice awarded the Medal of Honor, Butler was not only a warrior, he was a symbol, a living legend. But behind the medals and military decorum was a mind sharpened by experience and soured by betrayal. By 1933, Butler had come to view many of his past campaigns not as heroic missions, but as operations serving the interests of corporations and financiers. He famously declared, "I spent 33 years being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers." So when mysterious businessmen approached him with a strange proposition, Butler didn't brush it off. He listened. They spoke of fear of Roosevelt's reforms, of socialism creeping in, of labor unrest. They spoke of saving the country. They claimed they could raise a private army of 500,000 veterans, many from the American Legion, ready to follow Butler anywhere. The plan was polished, deliberate, and funded. One man, Gerald McGuire, acted as the face of the conspiracy, telling Butler he represented a secret coalition of America's wealthiest families and industrial leaders. McGuire described how European fascist regimes, particularly Mussolini's Italy, had restored order and preserved capitalism. He said it was time America followed suit. Their plan was breathtaking in scale. Roosevelt would remain in office, but only as a figurehead. Real power would be seized by Butler, backed by veterans and Wall Street cash. The Constitution would be quietly suspended and fascist-style order imposed under the guise of rescue. But they had misjudged their man. Butler pretended to be interested. He played along, gathering names, letters, and details. But all the while, he was preparing to expose the entire plot. He understood what was at stake. This wasn't politics, it was treason. And he knew the consequences of speaking out. What if no one believed him? What if the very people he named controlled the press, the courts, and the corridors of Congress? Still, in November 1934, Butler took the boldest step of his life. He marched not with an army, but with the truth to the floor of the House Un-American Activities Committee. There, under oath, Butler testified that he had been approached to lead a coup d'etat against the President of the United States. He named names. He cited letters. He laid bare the plot calmly, clearly, and courageously. And then the room fell silent. But here's the most haunting part of the story. Instead of sparking outrage and arrests, Butler's testimony was quietly swept under the rug. No one was prosecuted. No one went to prison. And no headline screamed about treason at the top. Why? Because the men Butler accused weren't outlaws. They were owners of the American system itself. And what happens when the people who fund the newspapers and bankroll the politicians are the same ones behind the plot? You bury the truth. When General Smedley Butler revealed the business plot to Congress, the implications were nothing short of explosive. A respected war hero had exposed a plan to topple the U.S. government backed by financiers, industrialists, and elite power players. Congress couldn't ignore it. They formed the McCormack-Dickstein Committee to investigate the allegations. What they uncovered was chilling. Butler's claims weren't just credible, they were confirmed. Witnesses testified. Documents surfaced. It was verified that Gerald Maguire, the man who approached Butler, had indeed traveled through Europe, studying fascist movements in Italy and France. He returned with praise for Mussolini's methods and boasted about building a private army of veterans. The committee's findings supported Butler's core allegations. They acknowledged the existence of a plan to recruit him to lead a force of 500,000 men and forcibly reshape the U.S. government. It wasn't fantasy, it was a failed conspiracy. But then the silence began. The committee released its final report during the Christmas holiday of 1934, almost as if they hoped no one would notice. It confirmed the plot had been discussed, but avoided naming high-level backers or pushing for criminal indictments. No one was arrested. No one went to trial. No punishments. The media, largely controlled by corporate interests, dismissed Butler's testimony as the ramblings of a bitter veteran. Major newspapers gave the story little attention or spun it as a misunderstanding. Roosevelt himself remained silent. Whether out of political strategy or fear of destabilizing the nation, the president let the scandal fade. The result? The greatest domestic conspiracy in American history was quietly swept away. What could have been a moment of national reckoning became a historical afterthought, not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real to face. The business plot wasn't the fever dream of a disillusioned general. It was the outgrowth of powerful minds with dangerous ambitions. Butler named Gerald C. Maguire as the man who approached him directly, but Maguire wasn't acting alone. He was merely the messenger, a pawn for interests far wealthier, far more connected, and far more dangerous than he appeared. According to Butler, Maguire was acting on behalf of a coalition of Wall Street bankers, industrial titans, and political operatives. And when Butler pressed for clarity, the names began to surface, names tied to the DuPont family, the jpmorgan banking network, and the conservative political organization known as the American Liberty League. The DuPonts, one of the richest families in America, owned Remington Arms, a major weapons manufacturer. Their support in raising and arming a private army would have been crucial. Their motives? Roosevelt's New Deal threatened their corporate empire, and they feared the rise of socialism, more than they feared fascism. Bankers tied to J.P. Morgan and Co. were also implicated. These were men who had long controlled the flow of American capital and had much to lose under Roosevelt's reforms. Gerald Maguire himself worked for a brokerage firm with direct ties to Morgan interests. There were even whispers of connections to Prescott Bush, father of George H.W. Bush. Bush's firm, Brown Brothers Harriman, had financial ties to German industrialists and companies sympathetic to fascist ideologies in Europe. All of these threads suggested the same thing. This wasn't a rogue plot. It was a blueprint for corporate fascism, drawn by those who saw Roosevelt not as a savior, but as an existential threat to their wealth and control. And the most chilling part? They nearly pulled it off. The business plot was real. The McCormick-Dickstein Committee confirmed parts of it. Smedley Butler's testimony was credible, detailed, and backed by evidence. So why didn't it become the biggest political scandal in American history? Simple, because the men behind it were too powerful. They weren't fringe radicals or outlaws. They were billionaires, bankers, industrialists, and political kingmakers. Exposing them would have meant dragging the titans of American capitalism names like DuPont, Morgan, and Bush into the spotlight under the charge of treason. It would have shattered public trust, destabilized an already crumbling economy, and potentially ignited mass unrest at a time when the nation was still reeling from the Great Depression. So instead of justice, there was silence. The committee released its findings during the holiday lull in December 1934, when most Americans weren't paying attention. The press, heavily influenced if not outright controlled by corporate advertisers and elite ownership, gave the story minimal coverage. Many newspapers mocked Butler or dismissed the whole affair as hearsay. Even President Franklin D. Roosevelt chose not to pursue the matter publicly. Some historians believe he strategically let the plot die in the shadows to avoid provoking Wall Street during his critical early reforms. Others suspect private deals were struck to neutralize the conspirators in exchange for their cooperation or quiet retreat. The result? No arrests, no headlines, no accountability. The most dangerous threat to American democracy didn't end in handcuffs or courtroom drama. It ended in a quiet file folder buried in the basement of history, waiting for someone to open it. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was a warning one that still lingers. When money and influence outweigh justice, even treason can be erased. The business plot of 1933 didn't end with tanks in the streets or a dictator in the White House. It ended with silence. But silence is not the same as justice, and forgetting is not the same as healing. Though the coup never materialized, its implications echo through history. The plot revealed that America's democracy was and is fragile, vulnerable not just to enemies abroad, but to the ambitions of its own elite. The conspirators weren't fringe outsiders, they were insiders, power brokers, titans of industry, men who believed they had the right to decide the fate of the nation. And when they failed, they paid no price. Their reputations remained polished, their families thrived. Their names went on to adorn foundations, banks, and even political dynasties. Meanwhile, the man who risked everything to expose the truth, General Smedley Butler, was quietly pushed to the margins of history. After his testimony, he became a vocal critic of corporate militarism, declaring war itself a racket serving the interests of the wealthy. Few listened. Over the decades, textbooks omitted the plot. Newsrooms ignored it. Hollywood never touched it. And so it became a ghost story for those who dared to dig too deep into American history. But its legacy lingers. It reminds us that fascism doesn't always storm the gates with weapons. It sometimes walks through the front door wearing a suit and tie. That wealth, when concentrated and unchecked, can become more powerful than law. And that even in the most democratic societies, there are those who believe their money entitles them to rule. The business plot may have failed, but it left behind a question that still haunts us. What if, Next time, no one speaks out. History doesn't always leave its most dangerous chapters in the past. Sometimes, it hides them in silence. The business plot of 1933 wasn't a theory. It was a blueprint for tyranny, conceived not in foreign lands, but in American boardrooms by men in suits who thought democracy could be quietly traded for profit and control. And the most chilling part? They almost succeeded. Had it not been for one-man General Smedley Butler, we might be living in a very different America today. But here's the question they don't want us to ask. If they tried it once, what's stopping them from trying again? In an age of corporate power, political manipulation, and silenced dissent, the echoes of 1933 still whisper beneath the surface. The past isn't dead, it's just well-dressed and better funded. So if this story stunned you, share it. Talk about it. Question what else lies buried. Because truth only survives when we refuse to forget. And if you're ready to keep uncovering the hidden chapters of history they don't want you to hear, then hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. This is Tales Beyond Time, where the past still speaks. And sometimes it screams.